We have learned about different periods of history throughout books, old tales, articles, but one of the most appreciated methods is undoubtedly cinema. We have all watched a documentary at least once in our lifetime, but what I'm about to reveal here is more about works of fiction, openly based on reality. Tapes would be invited to watch in movie theaters or while peacefully sinking into our couch. And as much as this is bringing back a theme from the past, allow me to invite you for a trip through time and space. And you may wonder, how could we say that cinematographic works through history could be representative of and informative about Prohibition in the United States of America?
Join us as we travel through the history of cinema.
By the 1920s, the United States reached what is still its era of greatest ever output, producing an average of 800 films a year, or 82% of the global total. At that time, the history of film was about 30 years old, but most of the movies were short and silent, until 1927. The comedies of Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, the swashbuckling adventures of Douglas Fairbanks and the romances of Clara Bow made these performance faces well known on every continent. And with the growth of the studio system and its great advertising method, the star system developed, which characterized American films for decades. The Western visual norm that would become classical continuity editing was developed and exported, although its adoption was slower in some non-Western countries, without strong realist traditions in art and drama, such as Japan. During late 1927, Warner's released The Jazz Singer, which was mostly silent but contained what is generally regarded as the first synchronized dialogue and singing in a feature film. However, the rapid transition was a difficult one, and in some ways, cinema briefly reverted to the conditions of its earliest days. The late 20s were full of static and other technical troubles, as artists in front of and behind the camera struggled with the limitations of the early sound equipment and their own uncertainty as to how to use the new medium. Many stage performers, directors and writers were introduced to cinema as producers sought staff experienced in dialogue-based storytelling. Many major silent filmmakers and actors were unable to adjust and found their careers severely minified or even cut short. Sound films emphasized black history and benefited different genres, more so than silence did. Along the way, the musical film was born. The first classic-style Hollywood musical was The Broadway Melody in 1929. Universal Pictures began releasing gothic horror films like Dracula and Frankenstein, both in 1931. In 1933, RKO released Marion Cooper's classic King Kong. The trend thrived best in India, where the influence of the country's traditional song and dance drama made the musical the basic form of most sound films. Gone unnoticed by the Western world for decades, this Indian popular cinema would nevertheless become the world's most prolific through Bollywood. The 1930s was a decade of political turmoil and economic problems. The Great Depression had affected the entire world. At this time, American gangster films like The Little Caesar and Wellman's The Public Enemy, both in 1931, became popular. Walt Disney, who had previously been in the short cartoon business, stepped into feature films with the first English-speaking animated feature, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So what about the Prohibition? It is important to note a circumstance that divided the cinematographic world, and that is the Hays Code, also known as the Motion Picture Code, applied from 1934 until the 60s. This code enforced principles that prohibited a movie from, I quote, lowering the moral standards for those who see it, and forbade the work of cinema from showing any sort of ridicule towards law or creating sympathy for its violation, which you may guess did not go hand in hand with gangster movies that could have represented any support to rebellion against the prohibition in the United States. Nowadays, we can categorize some of the movies into the pre-code genre, which, as its name defines, made its appearance before the Hays Code, and mostly went against all principles this letter claimed for. A lot of the movies that were made during the Prohibition were classified into the pre-cult genre and were completely opposed to its doctrine as well. We can cite two of the most famous movies that were sorted into this same brand. Little Caesar is an American crime film distributed by Warner Brothers in 1931. The film tells the story of a ruffian who ascends the ranks of organized crime until he reaches its upper echelons before being crushed down. One interpretation of the film's title character is that he is a repressed or closeted gay man.
Happy New Year, boys.
Evidence of the character's admiration and great affinity for one of his mates, and his lack of interest in romantic relationships with women. Ironically enough, the Hays Code held a part in which there was a list of items which could not be depicted and restrictions, such as a ban on homosexuality and marital or sexual relations between different races. Luckily, the movie did not face censorship, and the only complaint that was the letter sent by the writer of the book from which the movie was inspired, as he clearly depicted a heterosexual character.
Scarface. In the 1920s, the United States was reeling under the impact of Prohibition. The sale of whiskey, wine, and beer was prohibited by law, but there were many willing to break that law. Gangsters took over. Crime flourished. Mobs fought each other for prime territories.
There's no use arguing with this, George.
Scarface, The Shame of a Nation, is a 1932 gangster film openly based on the rise and fall of Al Capone. The first version of the film, version A, was completed on September 8, 1931, but censors would not allow its release because of concerns that it glorified the gangster lifestyle and showed too much violence. At this time, even though we approached the end of the Prohibition era, the pressure concerning moral standards was blatantly felt. Several scenes had to be edited, the subtitle The Shame of the Nation was added, as well as an introduction text, and the ending had to be modified. There is an alternate ending, version B, recalled by the Hays office, the same that would force the Hays Code 2 years later. That differs from the original ending in the manner that Tony, the character supposed to represent Al Capone, is caught and dies. This version would later be explained in a part of the motion picture production code.
The crime scenes in this film are based on events that actually happened.
Don't you know it's Valentine's Day?
As a need for all criminal action to be punished, and neither the crime nor the criminal could elicit sympathy from the audience, or such behavior had to be proved wrong, usually through compensating moral value. This film could therefore be noted as part of propaganda that was spread all over the country and that found its way into art. We noticed that when it comes to restrictions, the prohibition outlawed more than just the sale of alcohol, but also the freedom of artworks, and represented an era of mass manipulation through media, but mostly cinema. Not long after the ending of the era, unsurprisingly, the subject of the prohibition was still one of interest for film producers, especially that after the ending of the Hays Code, there was more liberty allowed, which erupted through cinematographic work. This led to different forms of movies. Some glorified the Prohibition era in a way, by focusing on the mafia and the gangsters' wars, creating work based on action, altercations, fights, and unscrupulous illegal alcohol dealing through mafia gangs. The focal point was still the outlawed manufacture, sale, and trading of alcohol, but with an approach that had as an aim to entertain the watcher. These types of movies are the ones that are still highly appreciated nowadays, and ranked as classics of the film industry, as they are aesthetically pleasing and making the most of skillfully written scenarios. We can cite The Godfather, released in 1972, as an appropriate example of such movies. Who has never heard of it? It was so appreciated that it even had a sequel. It is important to highlight the fact that getting rid of the code that tied down the art industry and prevented any evolution of cinema led to what was longed for. the growth of cinema genres.
Now you come to me and you say, Don Corleone, give me justice. You come into my house and you ask me for murder.
I ask you for justice.
That is not justice. I never wanted this for you.
It's strictly business.
So back to the musicals, because yes, even those can address such dramatic and action-filled subjects. I mean, have you ever seen a Bollywood movie? In these, we welcome a new participant to the show. Non-American films that still depict the era of Prohibition in the USA fairly, as they had an observer's position, allowing them to illustrate the historical event through the eyes of the witness. We can mention Bugsy Malone for this category.
You don't have to sit around complaining about the way your life has wound up. Think of all the time you're wasting. Time's a precious thing to let roll by. Sure, you've hit the bottom, but remember you'll be building from the ground up. Every day's another step that takes you even closer to the sky. So give it a try.
Bugsy Malone is a 1976 British musical gangster film. Surprisingly, the film carried the weight of its uncommon approach. It featured only child actors. Set in New York City, the film is loosely based on events in New York and Chicago from the early 1920s to 1931 during Prohibition, specifically the exploits of real-life gangsters like Al Capone and Bugs Moran as dramatized in cinema.
Lady luck is fickle, but a lady is allowed to change her mind.
Come on, you guys, who's with me? What's the matter with you all here? All right, that's no luck.
Yeah, me too.
And what about the rest of you? What about you and you and you? Why not?
Then there are movies that were of mixed origins, such as Once Upon a Time in America, released about 50 years after the end of Prohibition, and which, as expected, were supposed to have storytelling as faithful to historical facts as possible. We also noticed that in this wide range of movies, they are all of different genres, all while bringing back the same sensitive subject. Mob films, mostly known as gangster films, drama movies, pre-code, epic, crime, horror films, musicals, etc.
Bugsy's coming, run!
I will tell you God's truth. God's truth about myself. I am the son of some very wealthy people. Sadly, they're all dead now.
A classic artwork, inspired by a glorious piece of American literature, the award-winning and box office-breaking The Great Gatsby, in its fourth and latest version, released in the 21st century, almost 100 years after the beginning of the Prohibition. So you may ask me, what's so important about this movie? Well, first of all, it portrays the first ever version of the book.
Gatsby. He had an extraordinary sense of hope, but I had the uneasy feeling that he was guarding secrets.
That was kept and published by Fitzgerald. It's essential for literature to find its way through modern times, and cinema does a great job by inviting forgotten works of art such as this one into getting updated and rejuvenated.
Imagine me
certainly glad to see you again.
I think about you day and night. It's only right.
I'm certainly glad to see you as well.
So happy together.
I wish we could just run away. I've just heard the most shocking thing.
You and me!
It all makes sense.
You!
You can't repeat the past.
Can't repeat the past.
Why, of course you can.
History is fascinating when it's dealt with passion, and if you add art to it, then there is nothing more interesting than looking back on the past our world has witnessed and lived through. Coincidentally, cinema is the perfect form of art to depict history in the best possible ways, as it mixes with all other forms of art through musicals and alternative genres, such as jazz popularity which rose in speakeasies and allowed the people of the United States to discover and build new columns for the temple of its culture.